Welcome, everybody. My name is Peter Frumhoff. I'm the Director of Science and Policy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Delighted to welcome you here this evening. All of you gathered here are among our most dedicated supporters through leadership contributions, monthly donations, and legacy gifts. We are also pleased to have you join us today. This is a unique conversation for UCS, the opportunity to talk about how poetry can serve as a medium for artists, activists, and scientists to both broaden and deepen the conversation about climate change and environmental justice. As you all know, UCS works at the intersection of science and policy, bringing technical research and analysis to design science-based, equitable solutions to address our greatest challenges. A key component of our work is our focus on making science accessible and compelling to a broad audience of supporters, activists, policymakers, and the media. But of course, we all know that science alone can't achieve the transformation we need. In order to reach and mobilize a truly broad coalition, we have to connect with people's experiences and emotions, moving them to action. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce to you all the moderator of today's program, Elizabeth J. Coleman. Elizabeth is not only a friend, but she's a poet, an environmental activist, a public interest attorney, a teacher of mindfulness, and a poetry translator. She's the author of 3 poetry collections, 1 a University Poetry Award finalist, as well as 2 poetry chapbooks. Her poems have appeared in many journals and numerous anthologies. Elizabeth is the editor of Here, Poems for the Planet, published by Copper Canyon Press in 2019, an anthology of more than 125 living poets, which approaches our environmental crisis with urgency and vision. The poems in Here are introduced at the front end by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and followed at the back end by an activist guide written by the Union of Concerned Scientists. Kind of a nice set of bookends for a beautiful set of poems. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Elizabeth to you. So Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that lovely introduction and for your friendship. And thanks to all of you for listening. And of course, to the Union of Concerned Scientists for an extraordinary partnership of 20 years. I am so looking forward to the conversation with the wonderful poets you're going to hear from tonight. I became an attorney to pursue social justice and did so in a career of 30 years, first for a number of years as a poverty lawyer. 15 years ago, as the environmental crisis worsened, I came to believe we could not have social justice without a livable earth. And I began to focus my advocacy on the environment and on environmental justice and became more involved with UCS, which I'd admired since its founding. I'd always written and loved poetry, and eventually, after my children had grown, I received an MFA in poetry and published several books. So here, Poems for the Planet brings together 2 of my passions, poetry and social and environmental justice. The idea for Here came to me at the end of 2016, when I saw with horror and despair what we were doing to our planet and how marginalized people were suffering the brunt. Though in the end, of course, we're all in this together on this small planet. And I wondered, as poet Anne Waldman asks in her Here poem, will we fail to save our world? Here, Poems for the Planet is a call to face the crisis of our planet and yet summon hope and action on its behalf. A University of Pennsylvania law professor, my alma mater, called Here a brief for our planet. In his foreword, His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, quote, "We human beings are the only species with the power to destroy the earth as we know it. Yet if we have the capacity to destroy the earth, so too we have the capacity to protect it." Containing 128 poems by a diverse group of living poets from all over the world, 1/5 of them young people, The anthology approaches our environmental crisis with urgency and ultimately a vision of hope. Section 1 is a poem has poems about the beauty of the earth. Section 2, poems of mourning and despair about what we've done to our planet and its marginalized communities. Section 3 is poems for the animals. And then the 4th section circles back to hope with poems by young people. And finally, the 5th section contains poems of hope and inspiration, which leads right into the activist guide by the Union of Concerned Scientists, to whom I give all my royalties. Here looks at the daunting problems we face, yet asks for a renewed sense of courage in place of fear, which itself can lead to indifference and cynicism. In speaking to our hearts, not just our intellects, poetry can open us up to science. It can help us face even difficult news and ultimately give us the energy for action and even hope. As the Malaysian poet Cecil Rajendra says in his Here poem, quote, "I want the cadences of my verse to crack the carapace of indifference, prise open torpid eyelids, thick coated with silver," close quote. It's so tempting to look away. Here's a headline I saw just last week in the Washington Post. Dateline, Hadam, Iraq, from cradle to grave. Where civilization emerged between the Tigris and Euphrates, climate change is poisoning the land and emptying the villages. No one lives here anymore. But poetry can give us a way into hearing and bearing such a story, and a way perhaps into hope, giving us the strength to take the kind of action UCS has set forth in the activist guide at the end of Here. The kind of action so many are now taking now that they or someone they love has probably been touched personally by climate change. And the alarm has so clearly been sounded. As Here, poet Lee Herrick writes, "I feel like the saints are marching. They are singing a slow, deep, and beautiful song, waiting for us to join in." Thus, a theory of Here is that hope is a strategy for change. Hope gives us the courage and energy to do what needs to be done to protect our planet, our biosphere, and one another. The vision for Here was to leave readers stirred and ready to act, regardless of how often they've turned to poetry in the past and regardless of political affiliation. Some say this is poetry's moment. And as the great poet Audre Lorde, quoted in Here, says, "In the forefront of our move toward change, there is only poetry to hint at possibility made real." Along those lines, Copper Canyon Press sent a copy of Here to every member of Congress. This evening, we want to look at the crisis of the environment and environmental justice with such vision, with 4 wonderful poets. And we'll hear a beautiful poem from a 5th poet in a video midway through. The work of these 4 poets explores science and our relationship to the earth, our fellow creatures, and one another. Their work helps us look with fresh eyes at the world and open our hearts to science. These 4 poets will read their poems and talk just a bit about how poetry can help readers feel what science tells us and thus help move people to action. Today, when we're facing, as UC has put it, quote, "one of the most devastating problems that humanity has ever faced, and the clock is running out," close quote, "and the brunt of devastation falls on marginalized communities," we need these poets more than ever. Their passion, their emotional engagement, and perhaps their hope. And we need yours. So thanks so much for being here. So I want to tell you how the evening is going to unfold. I'll introduce each poet with a brief bio. That poet will read a few poems and say a bit about how she sees her poems inspiring and moving people to action in this era of climate emergency and environmental injustice. Then we'll have a short video presenting the poem of a 5th poet, and afterwards, I'll engage her in a short conversation. The 4 poets on the panel will have a chance to respond to that poem. In the final segment of the evening, I'll pose a few questions to the four, and they'll each have a chance to respond and engage with one another. The program is so rich and full that we won't have a chance for audience questions live, but we welcome you to engage with one another in the chat, and it will be wonderful for all of us to look at your comments after the event. So, we're honored to have with us two of the most distinguished poets in the United States, Kimiko Hahn and Jane Hirshfield, and two brilliant younger poets, Jenny Chi and Sarah M. Sala, who recently published their debut collections. By the way, I'm so pleased Jane will read a poem tonight she's read to a crowd of 45,000 people on the Washington Mall. Talk about this being poetry's moment. The lovely poem in the video we'll show after these four read is written by Maria Melendez Kelson, another award-winning poet. All the poets' bios are on the event website with more information about their work. Please go and learn more about each. Kimiko Hahn is the author of 10 books of poems and a number of chapbooks. Kimiko's two most recent books were prompted by science. Her books have received many prestigious awards and distinguished fellowships, and she has received many distinguished fellowships, far too numerous to name. Founder of the CUNY Chapbook Festival, Kimiko is a distinguished professor in the MFA program in creative writing and literary translation at Queens College, the City University of New York. She has also taught at other universities and served as president of the Board of Governors of the Poetry Society of America. Kimiko has a splendid poem in here, Poems for the Planet, which I'm hoping she'll read tonight.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Peter, Andrea, Fuja, and everyone at the Union of Concerned Scientists. It is such an honor. I'm actually awestruck. So thank you for including me. And Elizabeth, your work on the anthology. I can't tell you how thrilling it is to see an activist guide, as has been described already. It's a brilliant way of working, bringing passion to passion. I'm going to start with 3 poems from a collection titled Toxic Flora. This is a collection of poems that were largely prompted by the science section of the New York Times. The fever. The coral reefs are changing color, the black and crimson bleached away, the ocean's rising fever. In every drop the sea's over damages the membrane of symbiotic algae, and coral reefs change their color. True, it's less sensational than acts of terror. True, we can slather sunblock than sunbathe, despite the ocean's rising fever. After all, the planet isn't boiling over. Algae is not an inflamed country. It's just coral reefs changing color. I wonder if it's yet again the ozone layer ruined by my aunt's persistent use of hairspray, this ocean's rising fever. I already own my share of vivid jewelry from my mother's childhood village on Maui. Still, the living are losing color in my ocean's escalating fever. Icebreaker. Scientists, unnerved by stretches of melted ice around the North Pole, cannot discern whether the pace of change is mostly greenhouse gas or natural influence missed in earlier forecasts. Shipping magnates and drillers of oil are not displeased for the now watery sea routes and care less how polar bears scavenge to eat and reproduce. Ice retreat, ice deficit, thawing permafrost, Arctic oscillation, that we cannot care beyond filling a gas tank or wondering if a summer patio will be underwater. may be the ironic side effect of evolutionary biology, or just plain narcissism, or just plain laziness or laxness, or just plain greed, or just plain brainlessness, or just plain lack of imagination. That Arctic sinkhole. For me, science, I was raised in a family of artists, and for me, the language of science is very exotic. And so I am drawn to the language itself, and I find myself pulled in to the information, and I use it the way a potter might use clay to make something new. Hence words like Arctic oscillation. This next poem is from a sequence also in Toxic Flora, a sequence called Reckless Sonnets, and it's prompted by, this sequence is prompted by a book on extinct birds. Penguinus impennis. Large, flightless, and defenseless, the great auk was captured for feathers for feather beds, hunters loosening the plumage in cauldrons, fueled with the oil from freshly killed ox before them. After the 1830 volcanic eruption in Iceland, after museums and collectors vied for the near extinct penguin of the North, in 1844, the last pair was beaten to their deaths and their solitary egg dashed on the rocks of Eldey Island. Could we not sleep on straw or goose down? What dreams are worth such extinction? And are they dreams I'd wish to own? My own sense of how artists participate in social movements is to be citizens. And I like to bring my poems to all different audiences, and to my audiences, poetry audiences and readers, bring my sense of determination and political wherewithal, progressive political wherewithal. So my MO, I'm fond of saying, is connecting the dots. Art, science, art, economics, all the dots. I'm going to end with this very short one that's in my book, Brain Fever. It's a little playful and a little scary, I think. We'll see. Frank? In the Middle Ages, Dr. Roy Gulick said, corpses of people who died of plague were used as biological weapons by catapulting them into walled cities. This infected townspeople and catapulters alike, though it's unclear whether the disease spread by bodily secretions or fleas. Why Frank from Valhalla, New York, would ask a news blogger if one could contract plague from a corpse, I can only imagine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kimiko. That was beautiful. Sarah M. Sala is a queer poet and educator of Polish-Lebanese descent. Her 2020 debut collection was a finalist for numerous awards. Her poem, Hydrogen, which she'll read tonight, was featured on NPR's Radiolab. A poetry editor at the Bellevue Literary Review, Sarah is a clinical assistant professor in the expository writing program at NYU. In June, Sarah moderated a panel of poets discussing the intersection between science and poetry, and Jenny Chi, who will read after Sarah, was on that panel.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Should I dive in from here?
Yes, take it away.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm obsessed with science as a poet. So this is the perfect intersection here. Tonight I'll be reading from my debut collection of poems, Devil's Lake, which is all about queerness in nature and social justice. This first poem is called Hydrogen. You want to talk bang? Hydrogen was there at 0 hours in the coke-colored velodrome of dark matter. Gases checking gases ad infinitum. Chartreuse flare, then a deafening birth. Ions of cosmos cartwheeling pink, red, yellow, green, purple, blue, black in the sphere of night. First, I was a star, then a stain of water, then a kindergartner. This next poem is called Cadmium, still sticking with the elements here. When I talk of incompatible elements, I mean, before Game Boys and battery lust, cadmium was just a particle, tracing a coal miner's parted lip. Slender 0.1 dusting in the Earth's crust. Can you dig it? Now I'm the blue and green phosphors in Miley Cyrus's genderqueer color television. No, we can't stop. No, we won't stop. Electroplating with abandon. This is called Obad. Sometimes when my love and I lay senseless in the wool pack of sleep, I recall the coma. Nebulous cloud of ice and dust sublimating the nucleus of a comet. And it becomes the fuzz of a workday burned up in commuter traffic, or lost in the Oort cloud of meetings. When my partner steps out for work, I get a twinge of loss. Then comes that plush feeling of domesticity, that infinite fish turning inside me. On the same night as the Charleston church shooting, I listened to the scientist recording of a plant dying of thirst. It sounds like the first drops of rain striking an air conditioner, then a torrential downpour. In America, it's possible for a white supremacist to sit in a prayer meeting for an hour, then kill 9 Black parishioners. The living ask, where do we go to get free? Where do we go to live? The human heart weighs only as much as a can of Coke. Very often I find inspiration for poems from social media, from things that other poets are thinking through or grieving through. And Obad definitely came from that. It came from a friend posting about that shooting, but also the juxtaposition of listening to a video of a plant dying of thirst as well. Earth 2018. Now, when the planet made its efforts to break free, a FedEx employee discovered M77232917, the largest prime number ever decoded. Scientists mined ice on Mars, bands of snow dating back 1 million years, discovered Earth's lost 8th continent, and 7 new planets in the Goldilocks zone, neither too hot nor too cold to sustain life. Other disasters that now seem miserable, elections, wildfires, mudslides, and influenzas. Humans did not let rain, floating night, or tomorrow stop Earth's leave going. Consumption, the naked invader we mistook for king. This poem literally comes from a list of all the cool things we learned about the universe in the year 2018. And the last poem that I'll read is called Interior versus Exterior. I think I was actually listening to Radiolab and going for a really long run and thinking about trees when I pulled this poem together. At my worst, I control the boundaries of my form. And yet, when divine, the self permeates the physical world. It's true, the atoms of our bodies grieve each other in death, just like a color doesn't occur alone, but takes meaning from other colors. The moon was a changeable star that ruled men's fate. Water was green and not blue to medieval cartographers. The complexity of ochre begs the viewer to grapple with it. We are swiftly becoming an indoor species. Yet scientists know more about outer space than the Earth's oceans. Humans brought the natural world into their homes to combat the rise of machines. Without us knowing, trees conversed via latticed fungi. Gender isn't something one is, but performs. We are a vast assembly of nerve cells, the continents longing for each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful. And now I'm going to introduce Jenny Chi. Jenny Chi's award-winning debut collection was released 2 weeks ago on October 13th. Born to Chinese immigrants, Jenny has a PhD in cancer biology from the University of California at San Francisco, during which time she wrote most of her book. She's created and edited numerous scientific manuscripts and documents, news articles, and a science storytelling podcast. She has a particular interest in the intersection of science and the humanities and has written extensively about health policy and equity and medical humanities. Jenny?
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you also to UCS and my fellow presenters. I'm so grateful for the work all of you do and am so honored to be here today. So I initially came to poetry through a great personal grief, and over time, my work has really expanded to the collective griefs that we all face urgently around climate change and injustice. And today I'm going to read 5 poems for you, mostly from my debut collection Focal Point, which is about these personal and collective griefs. What we grew in the desert. My mother wanted flowers, fragrant and lovely. So she flooded young seeds until they boiled in midday heat. And when they didn't bloom, she thought she could will blossoms with sullen silence. My father wanted fruit trees, hardy and useful. So he baked saplings in the sun until they brittled into sand. And when they didn't ripen, he thought he could shout them into submission. At night, I snuck into the garden and sang my pleas into the leaves. Still, the gardenia blackened and scorched. The jasmine shot its stars into the ground. The peaches puckered around unformed pits. In the end, all we grew was oleander. Pink flesh burst from clay, blowing sweet poison to the wind. The next 2 poems I'm going to read are very, very short, and I wrote these while getting my PhD in cancer biology and thinking a lot about the parallels between cells and humans as individual units. Biology Lesson 1. Cells need touch. Isolated cells wither, float away in a blood-red sea. Biology Lesson 2. Too much touch stifles. Even the toughest cells die, wanting room to breathe. So I moved to California for grad school, and I've lived here for over 10 years now. And in that time, I've watched it change and burn. And that has increasingly become a focus of my writing. So this next poem, which is actually not in my first book, is a burning haiboon, which is a form invented by Torrin Greathouse in which each section is an erasure of the previous one. California dreams. Wake up to the smell of smoke. Think the oven is on fire. The house is burning. But no, it's my mother. It's the trees. It's the neighbors. It's California. The coast, the city, the empire smells like campfire, like bonfire, like death pyre, end pyre, expire, smells like ash and smoke. California burns under jaundiced sky and blood-sick sun. Sick blood, slick blood, sick of blood. Yesterday, another fire, different smoke. I was still far away dreaming California, walking on sunshine, swimming in blood, sun, fire. You fire, you fired, you're fired. From a cannon, a smoking gun. Set alarms ringing like calls unanswered, calls to prayer, call from the dying, call to the dying. We burn. California glows, orange warning, detour hazard, acid, radioactive, tumor, cigarette, lava, nuclear meltdown, danger. Smoke alarm won't stop now. Stop. We are burning incense in the house. We are burning trees with the weeds. We are burning dreams at the stake. California soul lingers in the ears. These years, the skies, pallid, ashen pallor, a pall of smoke lingers. All the leaves are brown. Wake up the trees. The end smells like California. Yesterday, I was still dreaming sunshine in blood orange. Now we are in the trees. We are California soul in the skies. A pall of smoke leaves. The end smells like orange trees. We are a pall of smoke. And I'll close with a poem that I think of as my love letter to California and to nature. When this is all over, here's what I will miss. Running through the park, even when I hated it, cursed my legs for their sourness. The heron walking into the pond, small white reflection emerging from the verdure, so lush it brushes the sky teal. Bees floating from poppy to lupine to cobweb thistle, tender hum and churn like waves lapping the shore, like language, like love, so certain, how could it be any other way? Even the fog, that cool gray mist, stalking the shoreline, feeding redwoods pale honey from a mercurial god, feasting on city lights in waning hours. And at the end, squinting into the bright ocean, once described by the Greeks as wine, because they didn't have words for the color blue, or there wasn't yet blue, or maybe they were drunk off its immensity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. So much. And now I want to introduce Jane Hirshfield. Jane is the author of 9 collections of poetry, having won too many distinguished awards to name. I can tell you she's also the author of 2 collections of essays and has edited and co-translated 4 books collecting the work of world poets. As a poet working at the intersection of poetry, the sciences, and the crisis of the biosphere, among many things, in 2017, in conjunction with the March for Science in Washington, D.C., she founded Poets for Science. And on Earth Day that year, she read her poem, On the Fifth Day, a poem you'll hear this evening, to 45,000 people on the Washington Mall. On the Washington Mall. Jane, too, has a wonderful poem in here.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for all of your work in gathering us together. I am honored to be part of this conversation and to share with all of the poems that we have heard this exploration of poems and science. Thank you, UCS, for all you do. Longtime supporter here in a minor way. I'm going to start with that activist poem. It's called On the Fifth Day. It was written on the 5th day of the last presidential administration, which was the day that the White House took down from the website all information about climate change and instructed every scientist employed by the federal government not to speak about their work in public without having it vetted by the heads of their agencies. And this caused me as much pain as if poets had been censored. Many of my closest friends are research scientists. By the end of the day, I had written this poem. I emailed it to 3 of my friends. Each of them asked me if they could pass it on to others. And by the next day, I was receiving thanks from the Everglades and northern Minnesota and the Badlands. And that response turned into the project Poets for Science, which I created to start with for the first March for Science, which is how I ended up on the Washington Mall. So here is my poem of outrage and grief. On the 5th day. On the 5th day, the scientists who studied the rivers were forbidden to speak or to study the rivers. The scientists who studied the air were told not to speak of the air, and the ones who worked for the farmers were silenced, and the ones who worked for the bees. Someone from deep in the Badlands began posting facts. The facts were told not to speak and were taken away. The facts, surprised to be taken, were silent. Now it was only the rivers that spoke of the rivers, and only the wind that spoke of its bees, while the unpausing factual buds of the fruit trees continued to move toward their fruit. The silence spoke loudly of silence, and the rivers kept speaking of rivers, of boulders and air. Bound to gravity, earless and tongueless, the untested rivers kept speaking. Bus drivers, shelf stockers, code writers, machinists, accountants, lab techs, cellists kept speaking. They spoke the 5th day of silence. This next poem is recent. It's in my own most recent book, Ledger, which centers on the crises of biosphere and climate and social justice. But the science behind it is so long ago that it's hard to remember how exciting it was, especially to poets, when people first began speaking about what's now known as the butterfly effect. And the idea of the butterfly effect is behind this. No wind, no rain. No wind, no rain. The tree just fell, as a piece of fruit does. But no, not fruit, not ripe, not fell. It broke, it shattered. One cone's addition of resinous cell sap, one small-bodied bird arriving to tap for a beetle. It shattered. What word, what act was it we thought did not matter? So I'm switching what I planned to read because I thought I would follow Kimiko and give you a poem which also emerged, as several others in my life have, from the Science Times section. This is called Mosses, and it has an epigraph from the Times article published July 29th, 2020. In the Mojave Desert, a translucent crystal offers bryophytes much needed respite from the heat of the sun. For hypolithic mosses, it seems, 4% of daylight is right. They live, the headline says, by sheltering under a parasol of translucent quartz. The crystal scatters the light's ultraviolet, dilutes its heat, traps the night's condensed moisture to moss-sized rain. I think of these mosses and consider, perhaps we too are mosses, evolving to the parch of our self-made Mojaves, unable to bear the full brightness, the full seeing. to recognize fully the Amazon burning, the Arctic burning, the monarch's smoke-colored missing migration. An experiment not meant to last. And yet we found shelter within it. We pondered our lives and the lives of others, thirsted, slept. To the implausible green of existence, for better, for worse, we offered our 4% portion of praises. For better, for worse, our 4% portion of comprehension. And I think I've used up my 6 minutes, so I will save any further comments for the question and answer. Thank you for your attention.
Oh, Jane, thank you so, so much. I know all our listeners loved hearing Kimiko, Sarah, Jenny, and Jane read their gorgeous poems as much as I did. And I look forward to chatting with the 4 of them in just a few minutes. So now, as you know, the Union of Concerned Scientists spends most of the time talking about science and research and putting that science into action. But they know how important it is to engage people's hearts as well as their minds with this video project we're about to share. Just as with tonight's program, UCS is using art and poetry specifically as a way to engage people with science beyond just thinking about facts and evidence. And now I'm so pleased to introduce a brief and beautiful UCS video of a poem by Maria Melendez Kelson, the author of 2 poetry collections from the University of Arizona Press, who also writes speculative and crime fiction and works in content marketing. Maria is another poet whose work has received great acclaim. NPR's American Democracy Project broadcasts several of her essays on art and activism. Please savor this UCS video, and then Maria will join us on the other side.
Before I learned any science lessons, I loved this question in a children's chant that my mother stenciled on a poster over my baby sister's crib. Pajarito amarito, colorcito de un limón, ¿cómo quieres que te cante si me duele el corazón? I love that it asks an animal a question, ready for whatever comes back and answer. Can you and I, mi gran familia, stay ready for replies when the questions of our time can make our hearts hurt? We have to ask mountaintop mosses what they know about change. Ask hidden groundwater what it remembers of rain. Ask how islands full of voices can be heard above the waves. Ask how the heartbeats of a separated father and daughter sing separately as they hurt. Ask how to help, to feed, to heal. We can still, like children, ask more heartfelt questions about everything. Dirt, tall grass, trees, clouds, stars. And when answers arrive, we can use them to keep species and families alive. Our proven truths can become medicine or meals. I say the science of today should be at least as life-giving as the science of your best family recipes, as open as the questions children ask, knowing everything. Sun rays, families, a lemon-feathered bird sings to be heard.
And now we want to welcome Maria Melendez Kelson.
Hi there, Elizabeth.
Hello, hello, welcome. So I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions and just engage with you for a few minutes. One thing I love about this poem is the tone of childlike wonder combined with the profound nature of the point you're making. Can you tell us just a bit about how this beautiful poem came to be?
Sure, thanks for having me, and thanks to all of you who are watching. Rich Hayes, who is the creative director and deputy communications director at Union of Concerned Scientists, approached me in March of this year, and he was looking for someone who could write a work of poetry that could work to encapsulate some of the UCS mission on their English webpage and on their Spanish webpage. And 7 months later, which looking back, that's kind of lightning speed for a collaboration like this. 7 months later, we have this work that really has the wonderful creative fingerprints of a number of UCS staff on it. Bill Cotter is the videographer, and Claudia does the voicing of the poem, and a number of staff members helped me revise it and rewrite it. But in terms of the process, between several conversations with Rich and myself, I was trying to take sort of the essence of UCS's mission to shape the direction of science toward being continually more and more humane and more compassionate. And so that's how the sort of direction of the poem came to be, and that was the process for creating it.
That's really so interesting. And 7 months is kind of lightning speed for the poem itself. And can you talk about how the questioning of nature you propose relates to scientific inquiry?
Sure. The questioning for me represents what I think is one of the best elements of science. Science as a form of human expression expresses this sense that we're limited in what we can know, and we have to look outside ourselves to know more. And so for me, the questioning was a really important element of science as expression, and I wanted to keep that in the energy of the poem, because that's something that I really value about science, is that the way that it becomes a form of expressing humility or expressing a need to look outside ourselves.
Thank you. And you really captured that. And thanks for the great poem, the video, and thank you for your comments and
Sure.
for the gift to the poetry of science. And then I wondered if any of the poets on the panel want to share any reflections on Maria's lovely poem.
And while you're thinking, I know it takes a while to formulate a response. So while you're thinking of what you want to say, I just want to say to our viewers as well that you'll have a chance to respond and engage when the poem and the video are publicly revealed in November. So the viewers are getting a sneak peek, and stay tuned to the UCS communication channels, because we're going to have a chance for you to do a few rewrites and a few kind of creative engagements with the poem. So stay tuned, viewers.
Lovely. And I see we have, is everyone here? We have Sarah and Kimiko. And I'm not sure, I don't see Jenny and Jane yet, but do you have any thoughts that you'd like to share about the poem? Any comments?
Well, I will say how much I loved the surprising inclusion of the family recipes. The way this video makes very clear that there is no separation between the science of investigative experiment and the science of naturalist observation and the science that goes into every single one of us leading our daily lives through experiment and perfection and passing on wisdom. I'm sorry, that's not a question, it's just a comment.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Jane. Anyone else have any? I think Kimiko, you wanted to say something.
Mine too is not a question, just really more of a compliment on how lyrical and how musical the poem is, and how that's one way, a little catnippy, right? To get people, to lure people in, to listen and engage with what we have to say. So thank you for that. It's really lovely.
Thanks, Kimiko, and thanks, Jane. Also, I like the idea of musicality as catnip. I'm going to remember that to lure people in. And Jane, I love the idea of the science of the everyday. I think that's a great distillation of what I was after. That science is not all that esoteric, and neither is poetry, for that matter. There are elements of it in all our lives.
So I think that, thank you so much for sharing that beautiful poem with us, Maria. And thank you for being here and for that amazing video.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to all the panelists. I feel like I just attended a 9-month wonderful masterclass in poetry. So thanks to all of you.
Thank you so much. Well, now, good evening, Kimiko, Sarah, Jenny, and Jane. I'm so happy to be here with you in this virtual space. And as I'm sure everyone did, I so loved your readings. I was so touched and I was so moved, and they were so, but there was also that touch of humor. It was just amazing. So there's so much to talk about, and I know you have a lot to talk about, but I wanted to go a little deeper with the four of you as we explore the bridge between poetry and climate science. And you respond to one another in conversation. So if I might, let me kick off the conversation with a question. In February, a world-renowned naturalist told the UN Security Council that climate change is the biggest threat modern humans have ever faced. And it's well known that climate change is a particular threat to the lives and worlds of marginalized communities. In light of this, what role do you see for poets and poetry in this moment? Yeah, Kimiko, do you want to kick us off?
Well, I'll kick it off. It goes back to something I think I said earlier, or anyway, that poets are citizens. And I think wherever we go, to not have these walls between, well, this is art and this is science, but to really, again, connect the dots between the two. And to, yeah, I'll end there, but to be a citizen and to use our creativity towards social justice. It's not a very particular way of putting it.
But it's really important, the mention of citizenship, being a citizen and eliminating those walls. That's really beautiful. So any thoughts in response to Kimiko? Yeah, Jenny.
Yeah, I love what you said, Kimiko, about being a citizen. And I also am remembering what Peter said in the beginning about the need to tap into the human experience and emotion. And I think that is so true. Like, humans are driven by the tangible, by their personal stories and emotions. And I think that's where poetry comes in. Not to establish any walls, but also as a scientist, I know that it can be really challenging to engage people in something that feels too big and abstract. And so a lot of people might not care enough about climate change as a concept, unfortunately, or feel that it's urgent, but they care about their homes burning down, their neighbors' basements flooding.
Yeah, that's personal, also making it so personal. Yeah. Sarah, you wanted to say something?
Absolutely. Kind of just to piggyback on what Kimiko and Jenny said too, I think there's a cognitive dissonance between what we consider the climate and nature in our daily lives, right? So much of our lives, it involves buildings and concrete and consuming things and producing things and commodifying them. But I think this return to science and listening to scientists and looking at climate change as fact-based, not a political like item for us to banter around with, right? This tangible thing, like my neighbor's basement's flooded, there's wildfires in California. I think just kind of clearing all that away to just really see what's there. I think that's what good science and good writing can do for us.
Yeah, Jane.
So, you know, I think we are fundamentally human beings first. We are all sharing a catastrophe. And there was an idea at the very end of the video, which echoes one of the earliest statements I know about why poetry exists, which is at the beginning of the Kokinshu, the early anthology, the first imperial or the second imperial anthology of Japanese poetry. It is described as poetry rises in us the way one bird cannot help but sing back to another. And I think in the face of this catastrophe of suffering, which we are all witnessing in different climates, different areas, you know, drought, fire, flood, toxic waters in coming into the kitchen, we cannot help but sing back. And so first, these poems arise because, at least for me, because I need them myself. In an incomprehensible time, these poems are a construction of a life raft from one moment to the next and an antidote to despair. Then when you speak about the role of poetry, I think you're saying, what can we bring to the larger public if the larger public chooses to listen? If somehow the music of the poetry, that catnip that Kimiko referred to, actually works for a moment and some others happen to listen, we provide them with the great encouragement of company, of knowing that others are not only experiencing what you experience, but finding the resources to speak back into it, to bear witness, to give testimony. And the very beauty of every poem that I heard by the other three poets today, beauty gives us a reason to keep living in the darkest of moments. It is the radiance in the dark which gives hope. If you can find those burnished, opulent words to face into this catastrophe, that gives me a reason to want to put one foot after the other.
That is so beautiful. Thank you. You know, I really loved how several of you spoke about how you love the language of science as you read your poems and how inspiring you found science. And then there's also the question of what that you were talking about, of what poetry can bring to science. And there's this quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer, a botanist and member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation, who said about the language of science, quote, "But beneath the richness of its vocabulary and its descriptive power, something is missing. The same something that swells around you, around and in you when you listen to the world." And I know we've touched a bit about how poetry might provide that, but can you say a bit more about it and how poetry does provide that? Does someone want to kick us off? Yeah, Sarah, do you want to kick us off on that?
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking about how in the video, Maria's often talking about asking questions and listening, right? And as human beings, we often forefront ourselves as the most intellectual beings and things. It's also a very colonial construct. And I think if we look to indigenous ways of living, to folks who really value a relationship with the land, of wondering and finding moments of awe with things, I think all of our ideas kind of fall away and we're able to learn from nature how it heals itself and what it needs from us as well. So I think at the end of the day, does language fail us? Always, right? But language rides on the back of feeling a great resonance with nature and with something that we deeply care for. So I think in order for people to form an opinion about climate change, we have to have also positive relationships with nature, for especially young people to have those exposures. So our only, so we don't just have negative experiences of flooding and fires as well.
Wow. So the positive interactions and also the partnership, in a way, you're all talking about a partnership. I mean, Kimiko's citizen and Jane was talking about, and Jenny, about a partnership with nature, with scientists and poets. And that's kind of exciting. Did others of you want to speak to that point? Yeah, Jane.
Well, I will just follow from that to make explicit something that was already there in what you said, which is we will only work to save what we love. Mm-hmm. And so again, that burnishing beauty and praise and the intimacy with which poetry tends to look at the world. You know, there are abstract poems and there are occasionally even good ones. But mostly poetry is an art of intimacy and recognition of non-separation, of interconnection, of interdependence. And so I think it is it's in the very DNA of how poems work to raise the vision of empathy and connection and non-separation. And that is, of course, the wisdom carried by every indigenous spiritual tradition that I know anything about. It is the wisdom carried by myths. It is the wisdom carried by the world's, great basket of literature, is that everything is alive, and everything is alive together and touches completely. If you perturb the tiniest corner of the fabric of existence, it will ripple through it all.
And I just love the choice of that word, intimacy. It's so beautiful. Kimiko or Jenny, did you want to comment on that, or?
Sure. I'll just, in a way, amplify. Sarah used the word resonance, and hopefully when art moves someone, after the person finishes viewing or finishes hearing, there's a resonance that stays. So, and Jane, and well, I think we've all spoken about the sort of particulars, how we're looking at things, no matter what kind of poetry we're writing, a kind of particularity that moves us to write, an idea, an image, a childhood memory, a beetle, right? Or rage at this catastrophe, right? So if it resonates and it stays with someone, then I feel like I've done my job.
That's really beautiful. Jenny, did you want to say something about that, or should we?
Sure. I've been thinking about what Jane said, about how we can only want to save something that we love. And I just want to emphasize that point, and how poetry can really open our eyes and teach a kind of radical empathy to allow us to love something that we don't know.
That's so true. And I think that love, and also the word Kimiko used, rage, about what's being done to what we love. I mean, that combination that maybe poetry can evoke in a profound way. I love that about only saving what we love. And also we can only act when we're really moved to act by, as you all said, the catastrophe. So, and also what you're talking about, what I think is really coming out is kind of a shared reverence for science, how poets and scientists share a reverence for science. And would you like to say more about our role, your role, poets' role in helping us understand how much our fate is intertwined with that of other living things on this planet? Jane began to speak of that, so I'd love to hear a little more about that.
You mean more from me or more from others?
From everyone, whoever would like.
And one of the things that I think there's much more shared between the arts and the scientists than the old two cultures idea would lead you to believe. And one of them is the absolute precision of each of them as a technology of deeper saturation into knowing what it is we are always in the midst of already. And so, I think one reason each of us, what I could hear in all of these poems, is we love science for the vocabulary it gives us to say things which are not identical to what science says. Poetry, I often think, is so some problems, and climate change is not quite yet amongst them, but many scientific problems, you start an experiment because you think you can find an answer to it. And a poem is the experiment brought to what is kind of insoluble and unanswerable. We face into the dilemmas, the difficulties. Very few poems hold practical suggestions for navigating the next moment. There are a few poems with cake recipes in them, but mostly if you want to bake a cake, you go to a cookbook. Poems are what, if you are plunged into the absolute mysterious incomprehension that your grandmother's cake recipe is lost forever, as is your grandmother, and yet the love and memory of her are abidingly with you, and you have to do something in the face of this insoluble problem of transience and loss and grief, or even, the praise of something that somebody spoke about, words fail. And yet it is the task and role of poetry to say what cannot be held in words, but can be pointed towards by them or netted by them. And the full experience, using Kimiko's calling forward of the term resonance again, there is a resonance that comes with the work of art, which knows more even than the data of the work of art. So that's a little something more. I've rambled a bit. Somebody else?
Yeah, no, that's great. This sort of saying the unsayable, saying what can't be said. Yeah. Kimiko or Jenny, did you want to? Yeah.
I just wanted to add a little to that, and that I think people in the various disciplines, or even not disciplines, in various fields of work or thought, we name things, right? That's what human beings do. We name things, and I happen to really love the way scientists name things, and I like to get in there and muck around in that language. And for me, language is a portal into thought, feelings, creativity. So that's what I do. And I love that I can borrow, steal from science to amplify and use as metaphor. I'll admit it, but I love that part of science and honor it.
Thank you so much. It's so lovely that this evening is turning into a kind of love letter to science. Jenny, did you want to add anything? I don't.
Sure. The other thing I love about science, while we're waxing poetic about it, no pun intended there, is that it really comes from a place of curiosity about the unknown. And poetry really comes from a similar place, where we just want to know things and want to deeply engage with the world around us. And poetry just helps give some words to that a bit more.
It's beautiful. We share curiosity. Scientists and poets share profound curiosity too. So we're almost out of time. So just a quick, I'm just dying to know, because we struggled with here, Poems for the Planet. Does anyone want to say anything very quickly about who you'd want to read your poems about science? I think Kimiko and Jane spoke a little bit about it. You spoke about it with the citizenship issue, but I'm just kind of dying to know.
So your question, Elizabeth, just to reflect back, is who we would like to be
read and be influenced by your poems about science, if that makes any sense to you. Who do you picture as your reader for that?
That's a great question. And I'm kind of still thinking about what folks just said too. And I think I recently did a project, a collaboration with artists and poets to create broadsides, to make a poem into an ordinary object that hangs in your home. So I hope that my poems reach folks who don't consider themselves writers, who don't consider themselves poets or academics. I think a poem for me is a way to slow down, in a way to give attention to an object of adoration. So science has given me so much. We've been talking about curiosity and inspiration, right? So I honestly hope that my work makes people question what is a poem, right? It can be very relevant, it can be modern, they don't have to rhyme, but also what is my relationship to the world around me and how connected can I be?
That is beautiful. And we're going to have to end this segment on that note. Thank you all, Kimiko, Sarah, Jane, and Jenny and Maria, for your wonderful poems. And really, I need to replay this conversation. I learned there was so much wonderful that was said. And so thank you. So we're so thankful to tonight's poets, Kimiko Hahn, Sarah M. Sala, Jenny Chi, Jane Hirshfield, and Maria Melendez Kelson for their time, this amazing conversation, and above all, your splendid poetry. This evening was so illuminating and we hope inspiring to our listeners. I know you've left us all a bit wiser and perhaps just a teeny bit more hopeful. We invite you and our audience to give a huge round of virtual applause in the chat for these 5 wonderful poets. And now, to end, I'd like to read a poem I wrote for a broadside at the request of Copper Canyon Press for the launch of Here Poems for the Planet. And I realized that after what Jenny said, Jenny inspired me to say it's a love poem to the planet, because she wrote a love poem to California. So it's a cento or found poem, and it contains 8 fragments from the 158 poems in here turned into a little poem. And these are the poets from the anthology represented in the poem: Amy Nezhukumetatil, Catherine Pierce, Patty Ann Rogers, Kwame Dawes, and Mark Doty. And it's called Here. Listen how this planet spins with so much fin, wing, and fur, so loud with itself. Not a voice, not a message, but something like a lingering. A reggae bass line finding its melody in the mellow of the soft earth's breath. What did you think? That joy was some slight thing? And so thanks to all of you for listening and your comments in the chat. And I hope you'll draw inspiration from these poems and from this conversation about how art can serve as a bridge between the facts of climate change and the impetus to action. And thank you so much to the Union of Concerned Scientists for creating this beautiful space for this conversation. And now let me hand this back to Peter.
Sorry, Peter, we're having trouble hearing you.
Sorry. Can you hear me now? Thank you, Elizabeth, Kimiko, Jane, Jenny, Sarah, and Maria. I'm so deeply moved by this conversation, by the grounding and inspiration that all of your poems provide us. It's so important to nurture connections between poetry and science, as this partnership represented here this evening so amply shows, to both enrich our understanding of what's at stake and I can speak personally and say truly deepen our motivation to act on climate and justice. Thank you all for joining us. If you'd like to learn more about these truly wonderful poets' work, please access the link in the chat box. And as I know you know, UCS will continue to do our important work to press for policies to address the deep inequities of the impacts of climate change across our planet. Each of you with us this evening is a very important partner with us in this work. Your support, your advocacy, your determination, and your inspiration are truly essential to our shared progress. So thank you all for being a part of UCS and for joining us this evening.